Hello, welcome to I'm a Neurodivergent, chapter 36 of 52, tracking my discovery year of a late diagnosis of autism and ADHD. Sorry these have got so sporadic, and thank you to people who have reached out to check I'm okay. I'm okay, basically. Yeah, I've just been struggling pretty badly again these last couple of months and in a bit of a difficult place, but I can do one more of these and make progress. So these last couple of episodes, I've been looking at King's College London's Understanding ADHD course available in the FutureLearn website. I'll repost a link in the video description, as that's what I was doing and learning about at this point in my learning journey. For anyone coming to this as my first video, this series is basically recapping week by week that first year after discovering I was neurodivergent in my 40s, having had no idea why I struggled so much with certain things previously, and gradually realising why and trying to understand how it's all affected me previously. My autism diagnosis came first, ADHD diagnosis followed, plus a general anxiety disorder diagnosis, which is very often tied up with neurodivergence and co-occurs with neurodivergent conditions, and possibly dyslexia on top of all that, which I think I've mentioned, but I'm kind of tapped out on chasing any more diagnoses for the time being. I've just been a barrel of fun trying to get by and thrive, having all this and not knowing for my whole life, really is the gist of these videos. This week I'm looking back at my course notes for week 3 of the 4-week Understanding ADHD course, and the focus is on the causes of ADHD, nature versus nurture, basically. We touched a bit on these themes in week 1 of the course, which I found really interesting. I've got high hopes around looking back on week 3, but caveated by week 2 of the course on lived experience, which I talked about last time, being a bit of a disappointment for me on how few of those lived experiences of ADHD were from actual ADHDers. Nevertheless, let's crack on with week 3 of the course notes and see where we get to. The introduction to week 3 starts off with a reassertion that ADHD is largely a heritable condition. You're born with it, even though there's not an identifiable single ADHD gene per se, and that the causation, i.e. how it manifests itself, is complicated. It also promises to look at the role food and nutrition, as well as extreme early life adversity, can play in ADHD. So yeah, nature versus nurture, basically, or rather how both nature and nurture interact with each other through an ADHD brain to shape a person. So ADHD research is notoriously difficult because the condition comes about through complex interactions between many genes, each explaining small amounts of traits, but the whole of an ADHDer's presentation becoming much, much greater than the sum of those affected parts in many ways, as well as how individuals' environments impact on their lived experience and the way an ADHD individual experiences, processes, and comes to basically tame the world around them in really interesting ways. The way nature and nurture interact, or gene-environmental correlations and gene-environment interactions, to give them more technical research terms, can be both passive, where you're genetically predisposed towards certain behaviours, and evocative, where the way you are tends to evoke certain responses from others, and then the effect that has back on an individual, if that makes sense. With ADHD, and I guess neurodivergence more broadly, it's really difficult to disentangle these two things. But in my head, it all goes back to the mantra I've been repeating these last couple of episodes: ADHD plus environment equals outcome. Good environment, good outcome. Shit environment, shit outcome. As a late diagnosed neurodivergent person, I'm a big believer, or trying to become a big believer, that it's never too late to change your environment and start hitting different outcomes. Though if you found yourself kind of flying hard into windows, I guess. So nature first, genetics and heritability. ADHD runs in families. This has been known for a long time. There's a far higher likelihood of ADHD where it's already present in a family. Heritable neurobiology, brain structure and brain function, as mentioned in week 1 of the course, there are visible differences between ADHD brains and non-ADHD brains, both in terms of structure and visible activity, and whether ADHD may one day be able to be quote-unquote diagnosed with a simple brain scan. The course looks at the history of research into which brain systems seem to be related to ADHD traits and which genes regulated those systems, and in the early 2000s landed on the neurotransmitter system called the dopamine system, and specifically which genes controlled the dopamine function, i.e. the dopamine receptor gene, which receives dopamine as it passes across the synapse in the brain with a dopamine transporter gene. Dopamine, for people watching who don't know, is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger produced in the brain that has a crucial role in the brain's reward and pleasure pathways, that plays a part in brain functions like motivation, pleasure, memory, attention, mood, movement control, as well as in regulating emotions and addictive behaviors. There's a really good animation video available on this on the How to ADHD channel, which I'll link to in the description. I would encourage people to watch. However, on dopamine, over time it became clear that this wasn't the one clear quote-unquote answer to ADHD. Dopamine transporters and receptors were just one or two of hundreds, possibly thousands of genetic links related to ADHD, and research around chromosomes and the entire genome is ongoing in this field to try to understand the complexity of it all and why a sizable chunk of the population end up with significant variations in brain wiring to the majority. So, baseline summary of ADHD and nature, the causes have been and remain complicated. On nurture, i.e. the role of the environment for ADHD brains, by which experts mean from the moment of conception, when a child is in the womb, all counts as environmental factor and nurture. Studies have linked heavy stress during pregnancy, as well as smoking and alcohol consumption while pregnant, as creating a higher chance of ADHD traits later on. But some of that research is still disputed, and it's exceptionally difficult to disentangle cause and effect. For example, mothers who carry a gene for ADHD being more likely to be significantly stressed and have significant ADHD traits themselves, which just brings it back full circle to being genetic and heritable again. So nature, not nurture. And again, nurture in the postnatal environment, early childhood difficulties, difficult family relationships, social deprivation, and negative environmental circumstances. Are these environmental indicators factors in the emergence of ADHD, emotional dysregulation, low self-esteem, etc. in a child, as some studies over the years have tried to suggest, leading to the damaging stigma of bad parenting being a cause for some of these things? Or again, just evidence of heritable ADHD traits existing in adult family situations anyway, which are going to emerge in a child genetically predisposed to being neurodivergent, regardless of positive or negative childhood experiences. Current thinking's now largely coalesced around the latter, that the genetics are almost certainly there anyway, other than what the course refers to as extreme adversity in childhood, where extremely significant trauma can create, if not late onset ADHD per se, then very much ADHD adjacent traits and challenges at a much higher rate of incidence than you'd otherwise expect to see in broad cross sections of society. But that's more the high crossover in symptoms of ADHD and trauma response, although research into this crossover and that kind of chicken and egg nature of it is ongoing. So, summary of ADHD and environmental influence is also complicated. ADHD brains and understanding ADHD brains is really complex, both the what and the why. But for me, none of it rubs against that basic mantra of ADHD plus environment equals outcome either. Professor Katja Rubia from the KCL team goes into more detail on brain structure, again talking about disorders and abnormality and multi-system deficits rather than just differences. This course consistently does this, and it really bothers me. Like, I know it's a few years old at this point and predominantly targeted at practitioners, but we're not case studies. We're not interesting zoo exhibits. We're people. My frustration with the language. These are the people at the forefront of neurodivergent research. Like, don't forget, let alone shifting perceptions in the general public from deficits to differences. Just stop it, academics. Yes, you're helping in terms of understanding, but you're doing harm in terms of perception at the same time. All research is great, just reframe it as a difference, not a deficit, please. I'm going to keep calling this out anytime I see it because there are two sides to this and both need equal weighting. I'm going to acknowledge and highlight the first side of that from the course, but then add in the second side too, because much like week 2 of the course, there's some incredibly useful stuff here that just needs to be reframed a bit, I feel. So, in terms of traditionally regarded quote-unquote deficits, research has shown that ADHD brains do have smaller brain structures in a number of prefrontal regions. So reduced basal ganglia, which plays a role in the circuitry for cognitive processes like attention, decision-making, and emotional responses, and a reduced limbic system, which regulates emotional responses, memory, motivation, and can regulate drives such as hunger, thirst, and sexual desire. Within the limbic system, there are often, in particular, smaller amygdala, which processes emotions like fear, aggression, and pleasure, as well as the formation of emotional memories, and a smaller hippocampus, which, as well as being involved in spatial navigation, remembering locations and mapping one's surroundings, also forms and consolidates new memories, helps in the transfer from short-term memories to long-term memory storage, and is key in forming connections between memories and associated emotional responses. And even minor differences in brain structure can lead to challenges around self-control and impulsiveness, as well as inattention symptoms and timing functions like forward thinking. And ADHD brains can very often struggle with capacity for managing all this. And while these effects can often be minimal, in fact ADHD was historically called minimal brain dysfunction before it was called ADHD, so it's at least not that anymore. They can, yes, still be pronounced and compound on top of each other to make day-to-day living in a neurotypical world incredibly challenging for ADHD individuals. I'm not going to go mega deep on which bit of the brain is responsible for what. It's not my area of expertise, and there's plenty of videos online that do that, but one aspect of Dr. Rubia's various modules in this course that did stand out was, and I'll quote this bit, the inferior frontal cortex, together with the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, is crucial for timing functions, which are impaired in ADHD and which are closely related to impulsiveness. So ADHD patients overestimate time intervals, and this has been associated with poor waiting behavior because time seems subjectively elongated and hence is probably more insufferable, end quote. This was one of those light bulb moments for me in doing this course. What's now widely known as time blindness is becoming an increasingly recognised issue in ADHD, not only in being late for things you haven't allowed enough time for, but in massive frustrations with any kind of waiting or delay. For me, I don't mind travelling to something or somewhere, for example, but travelling back from somewhere, being in transit, being in stasis without the anticipation of arriving somewhere absolutely does me in. Like return journeys are torture. And lots of other stuff. The inferior frontal cortex helps neurotypical people out with. ADHDers can struggle with, for example, poor forward planning, poor future planning, impulsive choice behavior. And Dr. Rubia mentioned studies where kids have to choose between a small immediate reward and a larger delayed reward. And the ADHD kids are way more likely to go for the small immediate reward because, and I would hate to use the word deficit, but because functional differences in the inferior frontal cortex in terms of being able to focus on and understand the value of future reward and make decisions based on that, based on motivation for future reward, rather than based on emotional responses and instinct and immediate circumstances. There was a whole lot of moments for me learning about this and looking back on my life and thinking about things from this perspective. Given the way higher than average percentages of ADHDers that end up in criminal behavior or in substance abuse situations, that lack of consequence, I've done all right for myself, or rather I've had structures and support systems and innate privilege looking out for me. Or maybe it's been the co-occurring autism keeping my impulsiveness in check, that need for sameness and routine in some way cancelling out the more extreme aspects of the impulsivity I often feel but back down from. I don't know. I've often felt massively frustrated with myself for not being more spontaneous as I can be in my lighter moments, for having the desire to do something new or crazy, but then not doing it or starting it but backing out, and feeling kind of self-imprisoned and self-limiting and almost physically bound, squashing down, shooting for the sort of life I know I could potentially be living with a different mindset. I can see now, with knowing that I'm ADHD, that this has been part of the ongoing battle of co-occurring ADHD and autism. Massively frustrating, but maybe also self-regulating in a weird kind of way. Anyway, yeah, this stuff was just massive pause for thought in the ongoing discovery journey I was taking at this point in time, and just bits of the puzzle that I'd always been to myself just lining up and slotting into place for me. But, and I'm going to do a longer video on this before wrapping up this series, there is a trade-off, and these brain differences demonstrably give ADHD brains more creativity and original thinking styles and intuition, where we make and express connections between apparently unrelated ideas, think outside the box, have unique perspectives through associative rather than logical linear thinking, and demonstrably find innovative solutions to problems others don't think of. We can task switch more easily, the opposite of being on the autism spectrum. We learn to frequently adjust and shift focus, so can think on our feet and problem solve, often better than quote-unquote traditional brains. And because we learn to deal with and overcome numerous challenges and setbacks, we learn resilience and determination to get what we want, even if it can take us a really long time to break through and get there sometimes. ADHD brains are more prone to what's been called mind wandering and to intrusive thoughts when performing cognitive or attention-based tasks. And this can be both a deficit and an advantage for all of the problem-solving intuitive perspective points I just talked about. This mind wandering or mental clutter is known as the brain's default mode network. Neurotypicals can actively override this default mode of random thinking for concentration or attention-heavy tasks far more easily than ADHD brains can. In ADHD kids, this leads to poor performance in cognitive or attention tasks. In ADHD adults, this constant mind wandering can lead to either great disaster or great success depending on the environment. ADHD plus environment equals outcome. Nature plus nurture equals success. And from an individual perspective, viewpoints may vary. Now that I finally know what's going on in my brain, and others may disagree, but I wouldn't change it for the world. So while I understand why others do, I'm personally trying to stay away from terms like my disorder and deficits and abnormalities. Now that I know what's going on with me, I can see that it's a great vehicle for approaching things a little differently. And now I know my brain can go faster in certain circumstances and travel on different terrain. I'm, again, just personally, going to try to have more confidence pushing it in new directions and not just trying to keep it on the train tracks I've tried to keep it on previously that maybe haven't been the best train tracks for it. There's a kind of freedom I've been almost given permission to explore now. It's hard to explain. Anyway, none of this last bit is in the course. I went off topic a bit just to give an alternative reading to deficits, abnormalities, etc. Going back to the nature point, the course modules touch on whether we need trained psychiatrists or healthcare professionals to formally diagnose ADHD, or whether a simple brain scan could do the trick. Right now, ADHD is broadly diagnosed using a combination of clinician assessments, self-assessments, or parental assessments, all of which are highly subjective, and as many people will attest to, all too often get it wrong, particularly when it comes to biases and ignorance around cultural, socio-economic or gender differences, comorbidities and differences in presentations, not to mention geographic location. There's a huge variance in getting accurate assessments for both kids and adults. And Professor Rubio notes that misdiagnosis around ADHD runs at around 10 to 30%. That is high. That is way too high. And it's long been hoped that brain imaging can just give an unambiguous, objective, yes, you're ADHD, and cut out the randomness and inconsistency of receiving subjective assessments from unpredictable middle people. But at the time of the course, that accuracy with MRI data and brain imaging just wasn't there yet, with a high enough degree of accuracy that took into account brain structure and function of different representative patient groups, different demographics, etc. Basically, within small homogeneous groups, so all male or all only children, for example, enough similarities in brain imaging could be found. But the more intersectionality, the more heterogeneous the grouping, the more comorbidities, for example, the less accurate the imaging results became in identifying ADHD brains with extremely high rates of accuracy. And Professor Rubio felt that while this would certainly improve in future, machine learning would not become a suitable replacement for clinical assessment and diagnosis, but could potentially be used as a more accurate screening tool in advance of that, i.e. identifying whether ADHD may likely or potentially be present and putting an individual forward for a full clinical assessment based on that imaging screening. The course also talks about how advantageous that could be, as current screening methodology, as mentioned already, can be highly subjective and open to biases and ignorance, particularly, again, missing out girls and women who can present quite differently to this kind of still embedded understanding of how ADHD has historically presented in boys and men in terms of the diagnostic criteria professionals, particularly older professionals, have been trained to look for and are accustomed to looking for. Also, there's a lot of other things that look a bit like ADHD, or that ADHD looks a bit like. I've mentioned in these videos in the past the Misdiagnosis Monday series of Venn diagrams on the neurodivergent Insights website, which I'll link to again in the video description. It's really interesting to go through and look at where ADHD presentations or aspects of ADHD presentations can overlap with and be relatively easily mistaken for. So autism, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, PTSD and trauma responses, OCD, anxiety, depression, oppositional defiant disorder, Tourette's. The course mentions dyspraxia as well in terms of physical coordination, thinking and planning in the body, and I'll pop a link in about dyspraxia and ADHD co-occurrence as well to the description. The fact that a lot of these things can be co-occurring with ADHD complicates things further in parsing out what's what. At the start of my journey, I absolutely had to know what was what, which aspects of my behaviour are the autism, which aspects are the ADHD, and therapists and psychiatrists would ask me, why does it matter? Just concentrate on your challenges and how to mitigate them and feel less stressed or overwhelmed. Find a space and an approach that works for you and calms your nervous system, doesn't exacerbate it. And that suggestion annoyed me. I needed the intellectual understanding of what was going on with me, in my head at least, before I could get onto the emotional understanding, the me-centered understanding of how to manage myself and my brain more kindly going forward. But as I'm getting on towards 2 years since my late diagnosis now, I am gradually coming round to that realization. Again, why I think people should be assessed for all aspects of neurodivergence holistically, not let's see about one condition, then another condition, then another condition. It's all aspects of neurodivergence. They're not in boxes. And multiple aspects and presentations more often than not co-occur and coalesce into this unique bundle of you. And that's the thing to address, not picking yourself apart into constituent parts and try and look at yourself in silos. But it took me a while to get that, having not got any aspect of myself for such a long time. And I have every sympathy with people on a similar journey who want and need that breakdown to understand aspects of themselves in silos. The way you understand and process information about yourself is not only unique to you, but will perfectly plausibly change over time as well. I've slightly gone off topic again and away from my course notes, but one of the course participants did note on co-occurring conditions, and I thought this was really interesting, that inattentive and hyperactive ADHD could also just as easily be classified as different neurodivergent conditions that often co-occur as combined type ADHD rather than just one condition with different presentations. There's so many ways all of this could be cut, but all of them come down to what works best for the individual to get the best out of themselves and interact with the world in a way best suited to them and their skill set. And as a result, can we stop trying to make everyone jump through the same sized and same shaped hoops? Anyway, all of this assumes an ease of diagnosis that is almost never the case unless you have money for a private assessment. Catherine, the late diagnosed ADHD woman we heard from previously in the course, talks about very long waiting times on the NHS and GPs who just don't understand what ADHD is, still being massive barriers towards getting the right diagnosis here in the UK. She also talks about misdiagnosis and her husband being prescribed antidepressants for years before anyone even considered ADHD. Same with Catherine herself and anxiety, general anxiety disorder being very commonly co-occurring alongside ADHD and often just diagnosed as that. Catherine talks about finally getting ADHD medication that took away the need for antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, and also talks again about how the NHS didn't recognise her daughter's ADHD challenges because she was performing well at school despite lots of anxiety. But a private NHS specialist spotted it and diagnosed it immediately and allowed them to finally move forward as a family and get the right support in place. And this just perpetuates the problem that you can start to feel better if you have money to spend on private care and private psychiatry. But if you don't, at least here in the UK, you get stuck and bogged down in an ignorant system for years on end, not getting the help and assistance that would really help you get a leg up. We already touched on a couple of episodes ago the fact that ADHD remains underdiagnosed in the UK and Europe, overdiagnosed in America, and broadly just nowhere across huge parts of the rest of the world. The course invites students to comment on what a middle ground might be, and default regular mental health screening for kids, the same as physical health screening to check sight, hearing, etc., was something that came up. And I think that has to be a target to move forward. It's kind of staggering still that it's not. That mental health is still seen as completely secondary to physical health. Anyway, that's mostly it from my notes from week 3 of the Understanding ADHD course. There's a wee bit more I've not touched on in terms of food and nutrition and neurodivergence, but I'm going to leave this and come back and do a separate video on it because the course doesn't really go into it in as much detail as some other sites I've looked at on this. And parents will swear blind that reducing E numbers and artificial colourings, etc., reduces ADHD traits, but research doesn't conclusively show enough evidence of that beyond its effect on all children, not just ADHD kids, if that makes sense. But suffice to say, there's a huge link between gut health and mental health, and the brain-gut axis and the connection between neurotransmitters and the microbiome is an area of study only starting to be untangled that I'm personally really interested in, having struggled with gut health for many years, way before getting either my autism or ADHD diagnoses. The next video that I'll do, week 4 of 4 of the KCL Understanding ADHD course, looks at ADHD treatment and management. I'll either follow my course notes on that, or if the tone of the teaching annoys me again, I'll maybe specifically go through my own ADHD assessment and my experiences with taking ADHD meds for the first time and how meds can work really well for some ADHDers but be of minimal effectiveness for others. Alright, yeah, that's another one in the bag. Thanks for watching. Apologies again for the long gaps between chapters at the moment, and yeah, like, subscribe, share, all that, and hopefully see you next time. Cheers.